Welcome to Humble Beginnings, a podcast where we uncover the unconventional, more relatable paths to success. In this show, we'll share the stories before the C-suites, board memberships, and appointments, the stories of various upbringings, first jobs, career pivots, educational uncertainties, and more. This is the place to hear about their lives from the GovCon executives themselves. We hope you enjoy. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Humble Beginnings. I'm your host, Ziadeh, and our guest today is Mladen Brkic, Senior Vice President and Chief Financial Officer of Ultra Intelligence and Communications. Thank you so much for being here today, Mladen.
Thank you for having me, Amanda. It's a pleasure.
Right. So for those who may be unfamiliar, we'll just jump right in. The Bosnian War, which began in 1992, lasted nearly 4 years and displaced over 2 million people. So Mladen, I understand you were a refugee to the U.S. in 1996 from Bosnia when you were just 18 years old. So what can you share with us, based on your comfort level, of course, about your upbringing in Bosnia before the war, during the war? What was it like for you and your family?
Sure. Before the war, I think it was very nice, actually. I had a very good childhood. I think my parents, they had me a bit late in their age, kind of in their 40s. So I think I wasn't really expected. And at that time, they were advanced in their careers. And they were both interesting. My mom worked in the government. My dad was like a chief executive officer of a business, but he's an engineer by nature. So they spent a lot of time with me because I think I was a very welcome late arrival. And I remember my mom focused a lot on education and my dad focused a lot on skills because he was an athlete. So I ended up being a bit of a sporty nerd, I think, at school, which served me relatively well. And war started in 92. It was a bit unexpected. I was blessed that nobody in my immediate family died, but a lot of us got displaced, including myself. And in some ways, that negative ended up getting flipped into a positive because through that and through my knowledge of English, I ended up working as a translator and then emigrating to the U.S. So as you said, I came in 96 in the U.S., but it was very different. I had this very blissful, easy childhood and a very difficult thing to do, but it also helped because then I had something to aspire to when I came to the U.S. because, I wanted to get back to, if you will, where I was started. So yeah, that's the way it worked.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing. What did this experience, if so, did it teach you about resilience? I know this is kind of a theme throughout your life, so wanted to touch on that a little early on.
You miss 100% of the shots you don't take. That was probably lesson number one. So it was one of those things, you got to keep trying. It's important not to get discouraged. And, how do you learn from the failures? I think early on I read somewhere like, you win or you learn. So I very much subscribe to that. And hopefully if you're smart, you learn from your losses so that basically you have more and more wins and less losses. And that's pretty much philosophy that I've subscribed in life. Equally, it made me think about risks a little bit differently, right? You want to be risk aware, but you can't be entirely risk averse. And it's something I've applied in my career. I've taken pretty big risks in my career moves and occasion where we either succeed or bust. And then I work really, really hard. And when it turned out to be a success, it was really, really good. So that's kind of philosophically how I approach things. As a finance person, my job is to be aware of risks, but I try to balance that because, finance guy by nature has to be more risk averse than a BD person. So, but I tried also to look at the flip side of that, right? It's, I suppose one of the things that it lost me in addition to the resilience is, your reality can be your perception, but if you're able to look at perspective of the situation from somebody else's perception, i.e. their reality, you can analyze the situation much better. Those are probably two key things that I found were very beneficial to me learning early on because of the war and because of being a refugee and things like that.
Absolutely. And I understand you called yourself kind of a nerdy athlete. So what were your academic passions and interests growing up?
So it's pretty funny. English and math. I was really good in math and I was really good at English, which conveniently turned out to be what I'm doing. I like geography because I like travel and I always kind of wanted to explore the world, but those are pretty much 2-3 things. I never had a lot of interest in history, although eventually I learned that you want to learn history because it has a tendency to repeat itself. And if you don't do something different, inevitably it happens again. But yeah, the math was really, I like problem solving. It's my nature, and I'm very analytical. So math just kind of, came easy and natural to me. But at the same time, I'm not I'm an extrovert. I do get lots of energy from others. I'm not very good a writer. I'm not creative by nature, but I like human interaction, particularly verbally. So I like debating. Although I never really got into it in school. It wasn't a thing that was taught in school probably until I came in the US, and I was almost toward end of my college experience. It's not something that was taught in Eastern Europe like a subject unless you go into law school. So that was it. And then in terms of sports, yeah, like I'm 6'4", 250, and I'm the smallest man in the family. My dad was 6'7". So everybody did basketball, water polo. So I did basketball and boxing. He had this philosophy which I applied to my kids, that you should do a group sport and a single sport. So I did martial arts and I played basketball, and like I did skiing, but it was very much like, you have to be able to fend for yourself. But if you can only do that and not play with others, your success is going to be limited, which is a philosophy. When I heard it first time, it seemed ridiculous, but so did many other things that your parents tell you. And now, as I have three kids of my own, that's what I teach them. So I think that worked. That worked well.
Team sports is a lot of things that executives I've learned through this interview process have in common. They're a part of team sports, and a lot of that plays into how they lead. So it's interesting comparison.
Yes, very much so. Yes.
So I know you said you spoke English already by the time that you came to the US, and you were enrolled in university. So what was that experience like? Was there any culture shock for you?
So it's funny. Like when I first emigrated, I awkwardly landed in Queens in New York, where there was lots of immigrants, and I wanted to go to college, but I also had pretty big holes in my high school education just because of the war. But I was really good at math, and I was really good in English, which kind of ACT, SAT, that's it, right? So I had to learn how to apply my English to. I didn't study other subjects other than conversational English and English. So that was a bit of a challenge. But I find myself going to people that helped me, and I got into it's like a refugee program where churches, they sponsor families. So my parents came over, and we ended up going to Kentucky, which is like a whole different story. So I find that my cultural shock was almost less going from Sarajevo, Bosnia to New York than it was from Queens to Lexington, Kentucky. That was probably a bigger shock because that was very different. But you learn to love it. Like that's one of the first times. Once I left home, I found moving everywhere else was not that big of a deal. And I never stayed anywhere long enough that I kind of grew like some amazing roots. So it felt like I was always in passing. And I started college as a math major, and then I switched to marketing because I always had jobs throughout high school. I did lots of sales jobs, and I did bartending, and I sold Cutco cutlery. I did different things, but I thought I wanted to do like sales BD. And I was pretty successful at it. But then one of the jobs I worked in Lexington. There was a company called Lexmark. They make printers. So I ended up getting a job with them. At first, I worked in a print shop, and then I started working with their marketing department. And the marketing guys wanted to offload the budget to somebody, so they gave it to the most junior guy. So I ended up sitting down with finance, and it was like, for me, that was very easy. They're like, hey man, like you should do this. This is good. And then I added finance as a second major, bizarrely. So I kind of migrated through that. So I almost stumbled upon it, which is funny because my mom in the government, she worked in Ministry of Finance in the bank. And it's something that, although I was good at math, it felt boring. This wasn't something that I wanted to do. But eventually I got there, and it was really, really awkward. And it's my university experience is I never really got a proper experience because I had so many things going around between the job and figuring out how to integrate myself in the country. And I had this idea. I've tried to do different jobs, start like different companies myself, but it's very bizarre. As a bartender in the hotel that I stayed at, I met two guys. One of them worked for Honeywell and the other one worked for GE, and they were working on a deal together. And after third night of Tom Collins cocktails, they suggested that I apply to either one of their companies. Like they had these leadership programs, which was news to me. So I applied. I don't know how much they had with recommendation, but I got selected for an interview, and I did a gazillion interviews, and then basically I got accepted in G, what's called financial management program. So it still exists. It's a pretty old like scheme, and I mean that was kind of like that's where it started, and that was an interesting first job as well because it almost everything I did up until that point in terms of resilience and kind of accepting new challenges accelerated because the way those leadership programs work, I don't know, I'm sure you've heard this, right? But it's like every 6 months, it was a new team, new job within finance, new function, new boss. And I also had new industry, which was, it was like, first day of school every 6 months. So that was very helpful just to learn how to land and assess, whatever you land, like how do you almost develop like a methodology. What do you have to do in first 100 days and what do you have to do in first 180 days? And I've actually had that with me. I'm a checklist kind of a guy, but I have a checklist like, what do I have to look at every time I come into a new role? So, just because of that, like my college experience, it was good, but it probably, I didn't party as much. I always, like I didn't, it was kind of like school, work, go to gym, it was, and I, most of the time, because I ended up adding a second major, I had to go, most of the college experience, I had to go to summer school to catch up with the classes because I did have holes. So it was positive, but it was more work than I'd say, my oldest one is in college now, and I kind of look at, I think our experiences are slightly different, but it was a really, really good prep. Then migrating into the workforce, in some ways, it was hard, but probably not as hard for some of my peers that came, straight from really good college and like, okay, now you have to go work 9 to 5. There was this, I already acquired this discipline, like to show up and do the work. And, I had like time management skills because I kind of had to. So that was, it was an interesting experience. It was an interesting experience. Yes.
It kind of also speaks to like adaptability. I feel like, you're kind of used to moving around and then your job is a new position, boss, like you said, every 6 months, and you kind of have to adapt to all these situations. And that's a pretty young age to have to get used to that.
For sure. And it was interesting. It's early in my career. That was such an asset. I don't think that academically I was strong in some of my peers, but because of this resilience and adaptability, I mean, pretty much most of my career, I would get tapped on the shoulder for a job. I did not know until I left G. I really didn't know how to interview because I didn't have to. Somebody would always tap me and be like, hey, there's this thing we want you to do. And then I also had this thing, right? My strategy was take the toughest job in best locations because A, I could get best money. That was early on. And B, you learn the most from that. I had one job where it was almost easy. And I earlier in my career, I really kind of craved on chaos a little bit because I really wanted to, prove myself and like do this. So, but I also wanted to live in big cities. Because I was a city kid. If somebody told me I would settle in Austin, Texas, that would be highly unlikely because I really enjoyed living downtown. But like I said, I'm married. I have three kids, 3 dogs, and a cat. Downtown doesn't work for me anymore. It's something different. But that's kind of how the way it was early on. And in those tough jobs were either clean up on aisle 3 or I participated early on in like it's hard and complicated and actually less exciting than it sounds, but like a due diligence for a big IPO. Like I did like a big shared service consolidation. A lot of those biz projects, which basically way out of my depth, I feel like I probably never met the perfect expectations of the project, but I've done so well that personally I grew a lot. And that was like I found that to be a big career accelerator. When people ask me, what would you do? I say that like in your 20s, you can work hard. Like I pulled all nighters. If I do that now, I need like 3 days relaxation to
Right.
just get back to myself. And, I can go out and be with people till 2 or 3 a.m. And then, you work really, really hard. But that's the time where you have so much energy. And if you're smart enough not to waste it, you can actually develop a lot of skills, a lot of toolkits around your belt that later on I'm going to put that, I don't know when's that going to come useful, but it will come useful. And I found that because I did those things in my career, probably last 3, 4 jobs, I've always done finance plus role because I started understanding other functions, their perspective, how something works. So I've done supply chain, I've done commercial finance, but equally B, how do I do basics really, really well? Because 90% of the time, that's what you have to do. So and it wasn't, it sounds now really well explained. It was more when I went back and analyzed what I did that I realized that's what I did. And it's like, okay, that's actually a relatively successful recipe. But no, that wasn't a pre-planned strategy other than tough jobs and best locations. That definitely was, that was my thing. So, which is why I ended up, I lived in Chicago. I spent time in San Francisco. I've done lots of international roles. I kind of moved around. That was a theme for a very long time.
Yeah, let's talk about the progression of your career a little bit. I know there's lots of roles, lots of locations, like you mentioned. Briefly take us through that and how different experiences have impacted you.
Sure. So my first role in my kind of, I did, so in finance, right, functionally, you can kind of split it controllership, which is books have to be stated correctly. So that was probably my first rotation, and kind of financial planning and analysis, which is a lot of performance management, either past and then managing the expectation of the future. And you got treasury, audit, tax, etc. So I spent a lot of time in first two, and then I didn't a tax. I never really ran a tax org, but I worked in audits. I've spent a lot of time dealing with treasury and cash. And once you develop those toolkits, they almost kind of build upon each other, right? And then I ended up doing it in different types of businesses. So the locations are interesting, but also I ended up running financials for a service business versus a product business versus a leasing business is very, very different. But once you get those business models down, industry almost becomes, I'd say, 50, 30, 40%, 60% interchangeable, 30% it matters, but like the model works very similar. So I did that, and that made me very adaptable, and that made me very interesting for people to tap on for the new jobs, combined with the go fix things. So as I did that at FMP, after that, I ended up going to the audits, and then I'm going basically at a couple of analyst roles in the business, but they were interesting because I've done a role at the lowest level of operation and kind of like at a entity and then in a headquarters. And then I ended up going to G Corporate and to shared service, which at the time was very looked down upon, but it was very much focused on efficiency of what do you get out of labor, people management. What I wanted was I figured, okay, I got to manage people. And I ended up getting early in the career a large number of people to manage. So I think I was a controller at 17 people. Then I was an FP&A manager at like 30. Then I got sent, and this was, by the way, so I did a bunch of jobs in the US, and then they moved me to London. So I was in London for about a year. Then I became a controller for like shared service entity in Belgium for about almost 2 years. Then I came back to London for another 3 years. And then I was about to get my first full ownership P&L. I was supposed to be CFO for G Fleet business. So this is car leasing. Because I understood leasing, that's not a lot of finance guys, that's almost like a hard thing to do. But because I've done certain services and leasing, and I was very happy with that. I like cars. I'm a Porsche 911 enthusiast, as you can see behind me. And then I went to a dinner with a very senior ranking person, and G was one of these like high potential dinners. And somewhere in that dinner, I mentioned that I can write Cyrillic because I'm half Croatian, half Serbian, which means I can read Russian. And he got interested, asked me a few questions without me understanding why. And 4 days later, they said, yeah, Keith Sharon was the CFO, wants you to go to Russia and to manage a shared service there, which was a significant promotion, but they couldn't get anybody to go there. And I said there, that was not a very common thing to do, nor it was something you would say no to. I said, no, okay, let's do it. So went to Russia, and it was interesting. This was like 2010, 2011. So this was like Russia was at its peak, right? Price of oil is very low. It was about as modernized. This is all before Ukraine happened. Tons of expat, businesses booming. And basically what happened is they had a finance org that up until then dealt with selling large pieces of equipment, and they were about to start doing JVs and services. So they really need to strengthen the finance org. So I got there, and I probably had a balance sheet where if you closed your eyes and picked a line, it was wrong. I had a bunch of audits that didn't work. Taxes were not filed. Cash flow was like what? We couldn't figure out cash flow. So just tons of basics. And then the hardest part was people. I had a relatively small team that there was no way they were going to survive with the complexity that's coming. So that was my first big, reorg, figure everything out yourself. But it was fueled by growth. And the biggest lesson I learned then, volume solves all problems, right? If you have volume, you can ask for any money you want. So I asked for lots of money to go fix it. I will not say how much money, but they said, sure, volume is coming. But the business grew in 3 years for GE Russia CIS. So this was Russia, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan. The portfolio of businesses grew from, I think, like 1.4 million to like 2.7 billion in 3 years.
Wow.
And my team grew. When I got there, I had about 45 people. By the time I left, I had 180.
Wow.
And I've done things like set up offices, like, choose extensions on the phones. I mean, it was a very, very interesting. And it was also interesting because it's so far away. It was me and there's a couple of other guys. We were all basically Eastern European immigrants that worked in G that we got there and kind of had to divvy things up. but very much we were on our own. Like we really had to worry about cash flow, and we could call for help, but like you really had to figure out a lot of basic processes. And this is where another lesson that I've learned is if you master the basics, that solves 90% of your things. So I pay a lot of attention, right? Somebody asked me like often, like, what's your favorite metric? I was like, customer opinion, employee opinion, and cash. And they're always like, with CFO should have like 64 financial metrics. Like you do, but if you get these three, the rest of them usually work out fairly well. That and then process. If you can, as many things as you can put in process in finance, that works very well. So that was like that was a very, I think, transformational role for me, and it was really a challenge. And there was, I mean, I did like a couple of ERPs, just like a lot of things that sound basic, but in such a short, compressed time, I got out of that being much more confident as a leader. I was like, I can take on anything. And then basically from there, I went into Aero Turbines. It was a large equipment business. And it was also interesting because I went from rapid growth for the same reason, because price of oil went up. Business that I moved and suddenly went from being at the top, like steep drop down. So Aero Turbines is basically you take an aircraft engine and you stick it on a generator, it produces electricity. And part of that is business got restructured. Some of the people that got restructured went to different businesses, and I was happy in GE, but I kind of tried to work out. I wanted to do something else. I was at this point where I was like 14, 15 years in GE. And to me, I remember thinking, it's like, okay, so now either I'm going to be a lifer, because what a lot of people did, or it's time to jump and you kind of adapt. And somebody called me and made a very lucrative offer to go be a CFO for a company called GKN Aerospace. So it's like a British tier one supplier. It was like 10 billion pounds. So I went to do that. And that was also interesting because that was a broken business in many ways. It was a real commercial business, lots of defense. That's also where I really got, until then I touched defense, but that was like 50% defense portfolio, 50% commercial. And it had equipment and services. And now suddenly I added on top of that, up until then, I've done US GAAP, IFRS, and like statutory accounting in Turkey, Italy, and Russia. Now I added a defense component to it. And that was very interesting because not at that point I realized not a lot of people know enough about all these things to be dangerous. And I at this point knew basics about all of these things, which is what made me marketable and I'd say probably adaptable now even further, like to different P&Ls. So I did that for about 2 years. That business got bought out by a PE firm, and it was unclear whether I was going to stay or go. And then somebody tapped me on the shoulder again for a role that I was super exciting, Maxar satellites. So if Worldview Legion, like if you look at on CNN, the pictures that they take is Maxar satellites. They take the pictures. They're probably the oldest company and did that, and lots of geostationary satellites. So then I moved to California, went to Palo Alto with the family. And that was a business that was very close to bankruptcy because the market also started turning down. But it had amazing engineers and amazing technology. And that was a lot of like restructuring, very large bids. Like no bid that we did was under like 160, 170 million bucks. Like we had programs that were like 4 or 5 years old that were like 400, $500 million. So that was a very interesting thing. And lots of international sales and business serviced kind of NASA defense and commercial business. And at this point, I was becoming really, really good at defense. And then from there, just as COVID started, I got tapped on the shoulder by a former CFO from GCAN to come to Ultra, basically. And he tapped me, and there was a point to this. He tapped me because at the time, there were 4 businesses within I&C division. There was a business that has kind of software licenses. There was a business, Hurley, that had really manufacturing assembly. There was a business in the UK that does percentage of completion accounting. And then there was a business that does defense radios, but almost a commercial business model. And you had US GAAP, IFRS. So they needed somebody that knew all those things.
All of that.
And suddenly, like it popped up in front of me. So came to Ultra. And then 2 years after that, Advent acquired Ultra. And yes, that's my journey, impromptu.
That's eclectic.
Yes.
But it is kind of crazy how all those experiences matter in what you're doing right now. They don't seem disjointed when you talk about it that way.
It is. No, I agree. It is. For sure it is. And like I said, I think early on, if you have an opportunity to step out of your, like for finance people, finance and CEO typically are the only two roles where you kind of get a full view of everything that happens in the business. And if you're curious, and if you just peek outside of your numbers, like, hey, like what drives the supply chain in those numbers? Like, what are the top suppliers? What do they sell? You learn a ton. And you sit down with engineers, like, so explain to me like the design process or whatever it is that you're making. You learn a ton. And you go to the manufacturing guy and be like, I see your numbers, I see the cost of people, and I see, how you do the milestone. But let me walk with you on the floor and see how it is. You learn a ton. If you can visualize what you're doing in the numbers, yeah, I think it's a massive benefit. And I think for me, because I am curious, I can predict fairly well what will happen 6 months from now because I understand what happens behind the numbers. And that's the part where I think kind of looking at the reality from somebody else, or looking at somebody else's reality, right? Their perspective, putting yourself in their shoes. I find it to be very helpful in my job.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, you don't think of like program management when you think of CFO off the bat.
No, yet everything that you need to know that will happen tomorrow or day after tomorrow is happening in program management today, right? So for example, like people that do percentage of completion accounting, which is not a lot of people, but it's more common in defense than other industries. If you see a cash milestone in program management slip, if you usually you know that the only way you make money on percentage of completion business is if milestones happen on time. That's typically how it is. Because typically, if things are delayed, you get paid later and it costs more money to do it. And if you see that today, that usually means that you're going to have a profit hit 3, 6, 8 months down the road. So, but because I've spent a lot of time in program management, I've like, you repeatedly see it. So now I can see for early warning signs. If I see that problem, that's what I go look for. I don't know where I'm going to find it. I have to go ask, the engineering department, the manufacturing department, the PM, is it like electrical engineering, mechanical engineering? But at least I know where to go and seek for the problem. So, yes.
Interesting. Yeah. So, how would you describe your leadership approach and what experiences or life moments do you kind of attribute to those qualities?
Um, it's funny. My leadership style has been described to me, and I use it a lot. Is push, push, hug. uh, like I nudge people, but then I give them a hug when it's time to do so. And it's funny. Today I was doing with our cyber business. They're going to present a bid, and I told the BD person is like, hey, when I wear my CFO hat, I'm going to give you a hard time. But why don't you call me before, and we can have a working meeting, and I'll tell you what I'm going to ask for. Because I would much rather you come first time prepared to me and to the CEO with questions that I'm going to tell you what it is, then you have to come to the review. We say that it's bad, then you have to go back. You feel bad about yourself. So that's the hug part of it. And then I will still push them for the execution. But yeah, it's push, push, hug. I'd say I'm very commercially focused. I find I push everybody at the time of winning the work to understand how we're going to deliver it. So I often ask at the bid time, like, what's the deliverable? Because if you understand what do you need to deliver, there's a much bigger chance that you will actually be successful at it, and which typically means it's a bigger chance that you'll make money. If you do not know what is it that you have to deliver and how, there's about 10% chance that you'll make money on it. It's purely by luck, and but that's not that's it can't guarantee on that. So I think there's that. I try to be predictable. I try to be factual. I try to be predictable on things that I'm push about. I typically tell people what I'll be push about so that it's not a surprise. I try to be very much authentic and tell people how I feel, and even if they sometimes don't like it, but I try to be fair. I try to treat them the same way I would be treated. And I think I've had a lot of people that work for me say, you're tough, but you're fair, but I can deal with that. The expectations are relatively clear. I think there's that. I know I'm a perfectionist. I care about how things are presented. I like clarity, so I like nice PowerPoints, fonts, and things like that because I find just if it's nice and neat, it's easier for people to understand what's going on in reality through the pages. Because obviously, whether it's pages, whether it's Word document, or whether it's Excel document. So I'd say things like that. And then, I try to look at, uh, I'll put my coaching head on. Sometimes people ask me to do it. Sometimes I'll do it. I like to do it spontaneously. I found that, if you have forced coaching and forced peers, sometimes that works on, sometimes it doesn't, but sometimes it just happen naturally. And I've done that sometimes for people in finance because I can see myself in them, or, they want to develop something that they think I do well. But I've also tried to pick people outside of finance to see if I can translate that on them. And lastly, I try to educate non-finance people kind of like what are the key levers that they can do to impact financials correctly. So I try not to hold the numbers just to myself. I try to explain to them because I find if they know what they have to do, my job is easier. It takes me a lot less to have to explain to them, right? So, I'll sit down and say, hey, over the next 6 months, if this is your forecast, here's strategic signposts that are going to tell me that your forecast is going to happen or not. If this happens, event Y. If this happens, event X. And then as they go along, they tell me like, Mladen, this event happened. Therefore, probability of this outcome is this much. Makes my life a lot easier. And that usually comes, you have to work with people for a little while. But uh, that's, I mean, I don't think I do, like I said, I focus on basic things. I try not to do anything overly fancy, but I try to be fair, try to be predictable, hold people accountable to tasks that I tell them in advance. And that 90% of the time it works.
Hmm. Awesome. And in terms of mentorship or, forming long-lasting relationships, I know how you'd mentioned you have never really had to interview for a job and were kind of tapped on the shoulder and a former colleague, pulled you in. So how have these relationships impacted you throughout your career?
I've had bosses. Most of my bosses, I have to say, either even if they didn't like me, was a fairly honest and clear relationships. And I tell people early on, even when they tap me, it's like, hey, if you need a CFO that you're going to say yes, I'm probably not the guy. So I set the expectations. I speak my mind even when I'm wrong. So it needs to be a partnership. And I've done that very early in my career, even when I was junior. And then equally, if you think I'm doing something wrong, tell me you're doing it wrong and why, because I want to learn from that. So I suppose with people that have mentored me, often I've engaged in what I like to call constructive conflict, rather than being afraid of is like, let's have the constructive conflict so we get to like some kind of a decision in progress. Even if we disagree, we've had it. And I found that to work well. And it's funny, a couple of my managers with whom I've started in a conflicting way, they became mentors. And I think now we're kind of in our stage of career, probably where we're friends than mentors. But one that had really lots of impact on me is a gentleman. He was in shared service. He lived in Belgium. Liam, I worked with him in, I guess, 2 or 3 jobs. But learned a ton about integrity and, this clear expectations with people and, how to deliver even messages that they don't like, but in as constructive way as possible. And when I started with him in the beginning, I'm not sure that he liked me. He probably thought, who's this kid? Like, I was very energetic. I work fast, but over time, like me, like my family and his family, we hang out sometimes together today. So most of my people that mentor me, it started a bit like that. It was very natural progression. And the mentorship that I give, it's equally, it started just working through people on problems. And then either I see something in them or they see something in me. And it becomes one of those, if they email him, he's like, why don't we get on a call and discuss it? And then we work through a problem. And then before you know it, it's like, okay, what do you think I should do here? Or I'll tell him, here's what I think you should. If I were you, and that's kind of how it starts. And I've been a few times part of mandatory mentorship programs and varying degrees of success. I'm not saying it doesn't work, but I found it to work best when it's natural. Because then, because also like when I have a mentorship hat on, it's very different than when I have my managerial hat on. When I have my managerial hat on, like I'm part of the management, I really have to look what's best for the business. When I have my mentorship hat on, I try to give people advice and context of what's best for them. And I try to keep those two things separate to the extent that I can, which the only way for that to work is you have to have like a genuine connection with the person that you're mentoring, or person that's mentoring you has to have it. That's what worked for me. And I know different people, they do it a little bit different, but yeah, that's what I found well.
Awesome. Well, I can't help but draw kind of a connection between, we talked about adaptability and clearly your comfort with change, and resilience. But do those factors kind of play a role in your life today, perhaps in terms of leadership or being a father?
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. It's I mean, yeah. When you asked me, another probably the most influential leadership experience was becoming a father. Like it changes your whole perspective, what matters and what do you do. And I think in some ways these days I'm probably fairly boring because all I do is it's work. I do family things and sports. That's pretty much three things that I do. But certainly, yes, I try to teach my kids. I kind of say in the same way in the businesses, I try to work hard, develop good habits. Like don't we I don't teach bad habits, whether it's in business or whether it's in life. And then I try to do those things not in an authoritarian way, but I try to do it in a way where they understand why. I think understanding why in business and in raising my kids that has the most largest amount of impact. I'm at this place where we have a 22-year-old, a 10-year-old, and a 7-year-old. So 22-year-old has gone through this period when he was like a teenager, and we just wanted to sell him off to somebody else, but now he's back. So I know that with my kids, it's coming. I'm luckily not naive about that. And I found the more you can teach them good habits early on, the habits stick with them, although you tell them I love you and they say, okay, right? They don't respond. They don't respond to that. But I figure I got like, another 2-3 years basically to teach them that. And same thing is with my dad, skills. My dad wanted me to learn how to drive, how to shoot early on, how to fight, like, how to cook basic 3-4 meals. So I do that as well. And I find the same as in business, basic skills, like stick to some schedule, have a plan, execute it. So those are the parallels that's kind of like a guiding North Star. And then around that, that's the stake on the plate. Around that, I basically put all these other things, which is, try to be a good human while you're doing it as well to the extent that you can. And then when problems happen, because that's in business, problems happen no matter what. Okay, how do we go and solve the problem? Like, just be honest about it. First thing, to solve a problem, you have to accept that you have a problem and understand the extent of it. Prior to that, it's all kind of guesswork in the dark. And but yeah, I think that's probably how I apply those two things together.
Hmm. Awesome. Well, to close, I've just got one more question for you. I know your path hasn't always been clear in terms of what was the next move or where life is taking you. But at this point, what do you hope to accomplish still, or professionally or personally? What do you still hope to get done?
Uh, it's kind of like professionally. I've had probably for the last 10 years, people always tell me like, "Oh, you could be a GM or go the CEO route or CFO route." And for a while, I really wanted that. And it's funny, twice when I wanted it, kind of slipped out of my hand. I didn't do anything; it just happened. So professionally, I'm a really good CFO, I think. So I'm very content with that. I enjoy doing that job. It's good. If the opportunity comes to kind of do kind of a general management role, probably I would take it, but I'd be perfectly fine to continue being a good CFO. I've learned with experience, I'm not obsessed with the size of the P&L. I think I'm much more interested in like, well, what's the profitability? Uh, you know, I like industries. Industry needs to be appealing to me these days, right? It's for a while I worked in insurance, which is a gigantic industry, but I didn't find it particularly exciting. That's just me. I have some of my friends, they still work in insurance. So it matters to me what the industry is. And last is, who do I work with? In the end, I spend so much time either, you know, with work colleagues, with my family, or at the gym or in the dojo, that it matters to me who I spend my time with, right? It's I'm 45 now, so I have this perspective. If I'm lucky enough, I get sick, probably my generation will live to about 90. So I'm at about 50% completion. So when you put it in that perspective, who you work with really, really matters, and who you spend time really, really matters. So that's what I look at my career now, which is very different than I did it in 25 or even 35. And I'm not saying is the way to do, but my perspective, I think, changed. So that's what I want to do. I want to do interesting businesses. I want to run them well. I think something that defense has a purpose, has a real, particularly in today's world, you can kind of see bad things happen to good people all the time. So defense has quite a bit of relevance to it. So to me, I'm passionate about that industry. I like satellite industry was remarkably interesting to me. Space is super interesting. Defense is very interesting. So probably in those industries. And then, like I said, it needs to be a business that I find interesting, mentally stimulating, that I see that I can improve, and who I work with. That's probably the most important things. And then, personally, I define success. I'd like to be healthy because quality of life matters. And as long as my kids want to hang out with me when they're adult, I think that's pretty that's about as much as anybody can be successful. And I like to sit in my 911 and go drive, calm down, and basically I have a manual transmission driver. I tried to save the manuals, but I really, really like to do things like that. So yeah.
Awesome. Well, Mladen, thank you so much for sharing your journey with us and a lot about your professional leadership approach and the themes that have kind of trailed with you through life. I really appreciate you being here today.
Thank you, Amanda. I enjoyed it as well, and look forward to talking to you soon.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Humble Beginnings. Check out WashingtonExec.com to find more of our podcasts and profiles on executives. See you next time.